Supreme Court decisions have heavily impacted American policies for over 200 years. They have affected the nation as a whole, as well as individuals within society. The judicial branch helped shape American policies in areas such as civil rights, civil liberties, and federal versus state power.
In order to establish an independent government, the United States had to create a set of laws to guide American society. In 1789, the U.S. Constitution was crafted as the highest level of law, and in order to preserve its importance, President Washington passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. This law created the Supreme Court, which consisted of a Chief Justice and 5 associates.
Supreme Court decisions dealt with many issues of civil liberties. In the 1919 Shank v. United States, the court ruled that freedom of speech could be revoked when such speech posed a, quote, clear and present danger to the nation. This trampled on American civil liberties, led to many imprisonments, and established that civil liberties could be revoked during wartime. Another example on the court ruling on civil liberties was in Korematsu v. United States, which upheld the constitutionality of the internment of over 110,000 Japanese Americans. This shows how the Supreme Court was able to strip people of their civil liberties. In the 2008 case, Hella v. District of Columbia, an individual's right to possess firearms was guaranteed. The Supreme Court's affirmation on the issue of gun possession was an instance when it was able to protect people's Second Amendment rights and civil liberties.
The Supreme Court decisions played an active part in the establishment of civil rights. African Americans and women were two groups that were greatly affected by some of the decisions of the Supreme Court. In the Dred Scott decision of 1857, Dred Scott was a slave who sued for freedom because he maintained a long residence in free territory. His eventual loss angered abolitionists and established the basis that since blacks were considered property, they did not have the ability to sue. Another case was Plessy v. Ferguson, which stated that segregation of blacks and whites could exist in society as long as facilities were, quote, separate but equal. This worsened the quality of African American lives as they were constantly treated as inferior and subjected to facilities that were not equal at all. The segregation of blacks eventually started to unravel with Supreme Court cases such as Brown v. Board of Education, in which Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall ruled segregation in schools unequal and unconstitutional. This 1954 case was significant as it was the first step in a long and continuous process of the desegregation of society. The Bakke case ruled on the issue of affirmative action when Alan Bakke sued because he was turned down from UC Davis Medical School because the admissions program favored minorities when accepting applicants and he was white. The court allowed Bakke to be admitted into UC Davis and prevented admissions offices from accepting students based on race. This showed that the Supreme Court truly believed that justice was colorblind. Supreme Court decisions also dealt with women's rights. In 1908, the case Muller v. Oregon persuaded the Supreme Court to accept the constitutionality of laws protecting female workers. This case ignited public demands on the protection of women in the workforce. The Supreme Court made decisions on women's reproductive health in Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in 1973, and Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, which declared that states could restrict access to abortion as long as they did not place a, quote, undue burden on the women. Both of these gave women more reproductive rights.
The debate about how much power the government should have over the people has been an important issue in American history. In regards to Supreme Court cases, the rulings often dictated the amount of power the states were granted. After the Marbury v. Madison case of 1803, certain acts of Congress could be declared unconstitutional. This was eventually used to rule out future acts. In addition, this case established judicial review, a main component of Supreme Court structure. In 1819, Maryland attempted to destroy a branch of the Bank of the U.S. by imposing a tax on its notes at the McCulloch v. Maryland case. John Marshall, who pushed loose construction, denied the endeavor, and the federal authority was strengthened at the expense of the states. The Supreme Court also made decisions on property rights. Fletcher v. Peck was the main Supreme Court case concerning property rights. In 1810, Georgia legislature was swayed by bribery and granted 35 million acres in the Yazoo River country to private speculators. This case was significant because it protected property rights against popular pressures. It involved the earliest assertions of the right of the Supreme Court to invalidate state laws that conflicted with the Constitution. The Wabash case reached the Supreme Court in 1886. This case decreed that individual states had no power to regulate interstate commerce. As a result, effective regulation was emphasized by the passing of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Both worked together to stabilize the corrupt business network. Lastly, in the Schechter case of 1935, it was ruled that Congress was not allowed to delegate legislative powers to the executive. They further declared that congressional control of interstate commerce was not applicable to local business. This unanimous decision that claimed the National Industrial Recovery Act, a main component of President Roosevelt's New Deal, unconstitutional. This greatly affected FDR's policies and plans. The question of state versus federal power was the topic of several Supreme Court cases over the course of history and still continues to be evident in decisions today.
In the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, the U.S. constitutional law case in 2010, the Supreme Court held that the First Amendment prohibits the government from restricting political independent expenditures by corporations, associations, or labor unions. The case has remained intensely controversial for increasing the influence in elections that money can have, while most other developed countries have limits imposed on all election spending.
The decision on the Obamacare ruling by the Supreme Court in 2012 stated that Obamacare was declared a tax and not a mandate and was therefore declared constitutional. It also let states opt out of expanding Medicaid, leading to millions of our nation's poor going without coverage. This case greatly affected America's poorest 7% and was a major victory for those who seek to repeal Obamacare. Anti-Obamacare states going against the federal government are in danger of losing the option of Medicare, thus leaving the nation's poor 7% without health insurance.
Certain figures who served on the Supreme Court brought their own unique perspectives and beliefs, which impacted the outcome of many decisions. John Marshall was a Chief Justice appointed by President John Adams. He shaped the legal tradition of America, which ultimately gave tremendous power to the Supreme Court. Earl Warren was a Chief Justice who shocked traditionalists with active judicial intervention in taboo social issues. He courageously led the court to address social issues that the President and Congress chose to avoid. Thurgood Marshall was an Associate Justice who served as a lawyer in the Brown v. Board of Education and Bakke cases. He was the first African-American justice to serve on the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first female Supreme Court justice appointed by President Ronald Reagan in 1981. She was the first woman to ascend the high bench in the Supreme Court's 200-year history. Clarence Thomas was an African-American jurist nominated by the Supreme Court by President Bush. He was a strong critic of affirmative action and was heavily opposed by liberal groups. He was also the second African-American to hold a seat in the Supreme Court. Altogether, these leaders shaped the policies of America by contributing to the outcomes of Supreme Court decisions.
The Supreme Court impacted important issues and debates that existed within society and set precedents for conflicts that relate to certain issues such as civil rights, civil liberties, and federal versus state powers. The judicial branch helped to establish the policies of America, and it indirectly and directly affected a significant amount of individuals and groups through its decision-making processes.